So today, President Biden had his big boy press conference. And actually, before then, he had the NATO summit in which he introduced Zelensky. Let's watch that.
And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin.
Yeah. So, in case you're unaware, the president of the Ukraine is not Putin. It's Zelensky. Putin is the president of Russia, who's currently attacking Ukraine. For all intents and purposes, he's our enemy because we are funding Ukraine to the total of a couple $100 billion at this point, something along those lines, some astronomical amount. So yeah, he mistook the leader of the country that we are allied with and the country that is attacking the country we're allied with. A little bit of a flub, well, just minor. After that, he went to his big boy press conference, and he gave a typical NATO speech that rah NATO. Without NATO, the world would become Russia. We're always going to support NATO. Yeah. Anyway, at the end of the speech, he said this.
I'll take your questions. I've been given a list of people to call on here. Reuters, Jeff Mason.
Okay. So this press conference was supposed to allay the fears that America has about him not being the commander-in-chief, not being all together with it, needing to have things scripted for him. But the questions are scripted. He has a list of people that he should call on. So he knows what they're going to ask already beforehand. Okay. Interesting move. Let's see if it plays out.
Mr. President, your political future has hung over the NATO summit a little bit this week. Speaker Pelosi made a point of suggesting that your decision on whether to stay in the race was still open. George Clooney and a handful of lawmakers have called on you to step aside. Reuters is reporting tonight that UAW leadership is concerned about your ability to win.
UAW just endorsed me, but go ahead.
Thank you. My question for you is, how are you incorporating these developments into your decision to stay? And separately, what concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president.
Again, this press conference was to help alleviate some of the fears that people had that Biden's not quite with it. He just called his vice president Trump. Okay.
So let's start there.
Yeah, let's start there. First question, the very first question of the scripted questions. He screws up. All right.
Number one. The fact is that consideration
it looks like he's
is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for president. I beat him once, and I will beat him again. Secondly, the idea,
I think
I
he's
served in the
reading
Senate
his
a
answer.
long time. The idea that senators and congressmen running for office worry about the ticket is not unusual. And I might add, there are at least 5 presidents running or incumbent presidents who had lower numbers than I have now,
That's weird when he leans into the
later in the campaign. So there's a long way to go
very often.
in this campaign. And so I'm just going to keep moving. And because, look, I got more work to do. We got more work to finish. There's so much, we've made so much progress. Think about it.
And when he talks about progress, a lot of the progress that he's made, I don't like. Gas is double what it was during Trump's presidency. Food is like double than it was in Trump's presidency. The job market is kind of horrible. Immigration is very horrible. The war in Ukraine, the war in Israel. I guess Biden gave us the CHIPS Act, so that was okay. The Inflation Reduction Act, so that helps with the environment. But as far as inflation goes, it didn't help with inflation. Inflation is a lot more than it was when Trump was in office. Hence the skyrocketing food. Anyway, moving on.
Think about where we are economically relative to the rest of the world. Name me a world leader who wouldn't want to trade places with our economy. We've created over 800,000 manufacturing jobs, 1.5 million. So things are moving. We got more to go. Working class people still need help. Corporate greed is still at large. Their prices.
Corporate greed. If not for the government and the regulations, there would be a lot more small businesses that could compete with the corporations. But because of the regulations and the difficulties that there are with creating competing businesses to the multinational corporations, it's very difficult to start those and very costly. The amount of red tape you need to go through. Red tape for a corporation is nothing. They've got a mountain of lawyers that are there to take care of the red tape. But the little guy, the mom and pop shop, they can't afford it. So instead of starting a new company, starting a new Tesla to go against Elon Musk, or to start a new bank, or start a new grocery store chain to go against Walmart or something, you can't. You just can't. That's why so many people are struggling nowadays, is because their entrepreneurial spirit is stymied. They just can't do it. So he's fighting against corporations, but I bet those manufacturing jobs were all part of a corporation. Talking out of both sides of his mouth, it sounds like.
The corporate profits have doubled since the pandemic. They're coming down, and so I'm optimistic.
Yeah, and all of the growth since the pandemic, they killed the job market during the pandemic, forcing people to stay home, scaring people into wanting to stay home. And then after the election, all of the pandemic restrictions were lifted eventually, and oh my gosh, job growth! Who would have thought that when you let people out of their homes and let people go back to their jobs, there's going to be job growth. Insane, huh? Why didn't I think of that?
Think about where things are going. Danny Kemp, AFP.
Question number 2.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to ask you about your, you mixed up Presidents Zelensky and Putin earlier today. And you now have sort of your key allies, including the British Prime Minister, the President of France, the German Chancellor having to step in and make excuses for you on that. Officials here are saying off the record that your decline has become noticeable. Hasn't this now, frankly, become damaging for America's standing in the world? Thank you.
Did you see any damage to our standing in my leading this conference? Have you seen a more successful conference? What do you think? And the Putin piece, I was talking about Putin, and I said, and now, at the very end, I said, here, I mean, Putin. I said, no, I'm sorry, Zelensky. And then I added 5 other names. Look, guys, the idea anybody suggests that
Now, again, these questions are scripted. He already knows what questions are coming in. There have been 2 questions now that go to his mental state. If they're already scripted and he's flubbing the questions as they're coming in, it almost feels like he's throwing it. Like he's intentionally making it look even worse. Is he going to step aside? Is there going to be something happening at the convention in, was it 3 weeks, maybe a month from now, where they're going to have a secret ballot or something? Is Kamala going to take over? It's a wild election season. There's some crazy stuff going on. Tim Pool actually talked about how the reason why, or his conjecture was, the reason why Biden has stayed in this long is to make sure that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. would not be able to run successfully as a Democrat. Keep him out, make sure that all of the delegates go to Biden, and then at the convention, Biden is able to step aside and the power players can insert whoever they want in Biden's place. With this press conference, it's kind of feeling like that's exactly what they're doing. That Biden is taking a knee here in the end zone, trying or making it look as bad as we've all known that it is, intentionally. I don't know.
we haven't had an incredibly successful conference. How many times did you hear in that conference? I know it sounds too self-serving, but other leaders,
Everything he says is self-serving, so I don't know. Yeah, anyway.
heads of state, in thanking me, saying the reason we're together is because of Biden, because Biden did the following. Look, folks, this is well, anyway. I thought it was the most successful conference I've attended in a long time.
Oh, he was
Find me
train of
a
thought so
world leader who didn't think it was. Next one. Nancy Cordes, CBS.
Thank you, Mr. President. You mentioned other instances in history where presidents have faced a challenge, but what makes this moment in history so unique is that it is not your enemies who are calling on you to reconsider your decision to stay in the race. It's your friends, supporters, people who think you've done a great job over the past 4 years. Have you spent time thinking about what it would mean for your legacy, which you've worked decades to build, if you stay in the race, despite the concerns that voters say they have, and you lose to someone who you yourself have argued is unfit to return to the Oval Office?
Well, look, I'm not in this for my legacy. I'm in this to complete the job I started. As you recall, understandably, many of you and many economists thought my initial initiatives that I put forward can't do that. It's going to cause inflation. Things are going to skyrocket. The debt's going to go up.
And it has.
What are you hearing now?
Inflation is
From mainstream
skyrocketed.
economists?
Prices on everything
16 economic
skyrocketed.
Nobel laureates said I've done a hell of a job.
I
And under
I
my
agree, he
plan,
has done a heck of a
so far,
job.
what's going to happen
but not a good
in
one.
the future if I'm reelected, that things are going to get much better. Our economy is growing. I was determined when I got elected to stop the trickle-down economic theory, that if the wealthy did very well, everybody else would do well. My dad was a well-read, decent guy. I don't remember much trickling down on his kitchen table. Middle-class people and working-class people need help. And so what happened is
The
I
best thing that
decided
can be done
to
is
was able to
removing
implement
regulations so that
what I believed when I was a
businesses
senator.
can start.
And that is that the way to build this economy is from the middle out and the bottom up. That way we grow the economy. And the wealthy still do very well. They do fine. And guess what? Find me an economist, mainstream economist who said we haven't done well. What have we not done?
I can find a bunch.
Right now? And so we got more to do though. We got to finish the job. And by the way, I come from the corporate state of the world. Delaware has more corporations registered in Delaware than every other state in the nation combined. I'm not
Why
anti-corporate,
is that?
but corporate.
Why is Delaware the main state for where corporations file in? It's because of taxes.
Corporate profits have doubled since the pandemic, doubled. It's time things get back in order a little bit. It's time, for example, if I'm reelected, we're going to make sure that rents are kept at 5% increase in corporate rents for apartments and the like and homes are limited to 5%. We're going to make a lot of changes that I've been talking about. Because
So he's going to start doing rent control across the nation? Maybe I misunderstood that, but that's what it sounded like. So you're going to boost inflation, and then you're going to make it more difficult for the landlords to make ends meet, which will limit the amount of landlords that want to do it, causing slumlords or huge corporations that can absorb the costs. Wow.
because we're going to continue to grow this economy. And by the way, remember how I got so roundly criticized for being so pro-union, not labor, union. Well, guess what? I've been the most pro-union labor president in history. Not a joke. And guess what? We had the Treasury Department do a study. When unions do better, everybody does better. Everybody does better. And we talk about how, for example, remember when we talked about getting the computer chip industry back in the United States? Used to be 40% of the industry. We invented the chip. 40% of the industry was in the United States. And former presidents decided that the best way to do it is find the cheapest labor in the world, send the product over there and import what the product was. And so
Part of the reason why the labor is cheap, again, not as many regulations. Yeah, they can pay them slave labor wages, but also the regulations are incredibly low. We can compete. It takes a lot of money to ship things from the other side of the world. Why not just make them here and get rid of the regulations so businesses can start competing? Come on, man.
what did I do? I was told not to go over to Europe. To Asia, including Europe, but Asia. And I remember going to South Korea, convincing them to invest $20 billion in the United States to build computer chip factories. And I asked why when they finally decided to do it. And the answer was because you have the safest economy in the world.
So instead of removing regulations so that U.S. manufacturing companies can start competing. He went to a foreign country and paid businesses in that foreign country money to start or to create factories in America so they can make more money. Yeah, pro-America right there, paying foreign companies to start factories in America. That's way to go, Joe.
You have the best workers in the world. So the whole idea here is we've invested, there's over $50 billion in investment in computer chip manufacturing just coming into being. None of you thought that would happen. None of you thought that would happen.
Creepy whispering.
It's happening. It's happening. And it's going to grow economies all through. And by the way, red states and blue states. Matter of fact, there's as much in red states as blue states. I've made no distinction. So my generic point is that the idea that we can't continue to build and grow the economy, make it fair. Like I said, from my standpoint, when the middle class does well, that's when the whole economy grows. The poor have a shot, the wealthy do well. The wealthy got to start paying their taxes.
So he's not a fan of trickle-down economics, but he pays a major corporation in a foreign country to build factories over here, and those factories will pay the workers. That sounds like trickle-down, like a crappy version of trickle-down economics right there. And yet he hates trickle-down economics. It hurts my head.
Your Vice President Kamala Harris would be ready to serve on day one. Can you elaborate on that? What is it about her attributes and her accomplishments over the last 4 years that make her ready to serve on day one if necessary?
First of all, the way she's handled the issue of freedom of women's bodies to have control over their bodies. Secondly, her ability to handle almost any issue on the board. This was a hell of a process.
She's the border czar, and she's the AI czar, and I think a couple others. Everything she's touched has gotten worse, I'm pretty sure. How many millions of illegals have entered this country? She might be the drug czar, for that matter. How much fentanyl has entered the country as well through the open border? It's insane. One of her first speeches after they were elected was going to was it Guatemala? I can't remember. And her speech was, "We're full. Don't come. Don't come." And that's the limit of her trying to do anything besides going to the border, I think, once for a photo op. Beyond that, the only thing that's happened there is a lot of illegals coming through, and then Greg Abbott in Texas trying to staunch the flow and being stymied by the Biden administration. She's ready to go.
Prosecutor. She was a first-rate person, and in the Senate, she was really good.
Yeah, and as a prosecutor, I'm not sure if you saw the Democratic presidential debate back in 2020 when Tulsi Gabbard just lambasted her, talking about how she put people in prison for smoking weed, and then when she was asked if she smoked weed, she just laughed because, of course, everybody smokes weed. She definitely did. And she purposefully hid evidence that would have exonerated people that were on death row, and she kept people past their release date so they could be used as cheap or free labor in the wildfires. Keeping people beyond their prison sentence so they could be cheap labor for fighting fighters. She's horrible. And because of that lambasting, Kamala dropped out very early on, getting, I think, no delegates. And then because she's got the right skin color and she is not liked by anyone, Biden put her in as his own personal Spiro Agnew because no one would want her as president. But he says she's great.
I wouldn't have picked her unless I thought she was qualified to be president. From the very beginning, I made no bones about that. She is qualified to be president. That's why I picked her. Felicia Schwartz, Financial Times.
Thank you, Mr. President. Presidency is the most straining job in the world, and it's 24/7. How can you say you'll be up for that next year, in 2 years, in 4 years, given the limits you've acknowledged that you have today?
The limits I've acknowledged I have.
There's been reporting that you've acknowledged that you need to go to bed earlier and your evening around 8.
That's not true. Look,
Totally.
what I said was, instead of my every day starting at 7 and going to bed at midnight, it'd be smarter for me to pace myself a little more. And I said, for example, the 8, 7, 6 stuff, instead of starting a fundraiser at 9 o'clock, start at 8 o'clock. People get to go home by 10 o'clock. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about, and if you look at my schedule since I made that stupid mistake in the campaign, in the debate, I mean, my schedule has been full bore. I've done, where's Trump been? Riding around in his golf cart, filling out his scorecard before he hits the ball. I mean, look, he's done virtually nothing. And I don't know how many, don't hold me to it, roughly 20 major events.
When your enemy is making mistakes, you don't need to do much. I think that's a quote from a paraphrase from Sun Tzu in The Art of War. Really, Trump could have gone on vacation since the debate because all of the news has just been Biden is unfit. Biden is unfit. Biden needs to step down. It's all been bad news for Biden. So Trump could have literally just gone on a vacation ever since then, and he probably would have been fine. Maybe that's why he had that video of him on a golf cart released where he just made fun of both Biden and Kamala and said they're both terrible for America. And this is pretty good proof that he's right. He called his opponent his vice president. Earlier this week, Biden called himself the first female Black vice president. I don't know.
Someone with thousands of people showing up. And so I just think it's better. I always have an inclination, whether I was playing sports or doing politics, just to keep going, not stop. I just got to just pace myself a little more. Pace myself. And the next debate, I'm not going to be traveling into 15 time zones a week before.
He spent a week recuperating from that travel. How much time does it take to recuperate from travel?
Anyway, that's what it was about. That's what it was about. And by the way, even with that, I love my staff, but they add things all the time. At the very end, I'm catching hell from my wife for that. Anyway, I'm sorry, Zeke Miller, Associated Press.
Thank you, Mr. President. Two questions for you. First, on the NATO summit, President Zelensky, in your meeting with him, he pressed you to lift your limitations on the Ukrainian use of American weapons, saying that, in his public remarks afterwards, saying that Ukraine cannot win the war unless those limitations are lifted. Are you reconsidering your position on that? And then secondly, following up on Felicia's question there, leaders of your own party have said that they're not worried about that debate. They're worried about the next bad night and the bad night after that.
No, never mind.
How can you reassure the American people that you are up to the task and that there won't be more bad nights at a debate stage or somewhere else?
First thing about Zelensky asking for the ability to strike deep into Russia. We have allowed Zelensky to use American weapons in the near term, in the near abroad, into Russia. Whether or not
Near term
he has,
abroad?
he should be attacked. For example, should Zelensky, he's not. If he had the capacity to strike Moscow, strike the Kremlin, would that make sense? It wouldn't. The question is, what's the best use of the weaponry he has, the weaponry we were getting to him? I've gotten a more long-range capacity, as well as defensive capacity. And so our military is where I'm following the advice of my commander-in-chief,
He's following the advice of his commander-in-chief. Okay.
of the chief of staff of the military, as well as the Secretary of Defense and our intelligence people. And we're making a day-to-day basis on what they should and shouldn't go, how far they should go in. That's a logical thing to do. Second question related to
Bad nights, sir. How can you reassure the American people that you won't have more bad nights, whether they be on a debate stage or it's a matter of foreign policy?
Well, I tell you what, the best way to assure them is the way I assure myself. And that is, am I getting the job done? Am I getting the job done? Can you name me somebody who's got more major piece of legislation passed in 3.5 years? Created 2,000 jobs just last week. So if I slow down, I can't get the job done.
I don't know what jobs he's talking about, but I've mentioned before, the president can't create any jobs unless he's talking about more government jobs. And the government is a draw on the wealth of the country. So he's either lying, which that might be the case, or he's talking about government jobs, and that hurts the country more financially. So I don't know which it is.
Done. That's a sign that I shouldn't be doing it. But there's no indication of that yet. None. Who I got here? Merrick, Pulaski Radio.
Thank you, Mr. President. How are you?
I'm well.
The elections in the US have consequences around the world. You have pretty high standing in Europe. I just asked President Macron about you, and he said we are happy to have him as the President of the United States. But there is a concern. Many people in Poland and across Europe are worried that the former president may win the election. And there's a lot of concern that Donald Trump may weaken NATO, stop supporting Ukraine, or push Ukraine to give up territories to Russia.
They're correct.
And yourself was warning just 2 minutes ago about it. So my question is, do you think that Europe will be left on its own if Donald Trump wins the election? And what's your advice to European leaders to prepare for possible US disengagement?
Well, look,
Before he talks, Putin has been willing to negotiate since day one. And even before he entered Ukraine, he talked about how Ukraine entering NATO was the brightest of red lines. Zelensky was he was in talks with Putin early on, but the former Prime Minister of England lost his name, Boris Johnson. He flew to Ukraine to stop those negotiations. Then the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up by no one is sure who, but there's only a few countries that can do that type of underwater demolition, and America's one of those countries. And Biden's never talked, that I know of, seriously about negotiations, which that is the only way to end a war unless you completely demolish your opponent. And I'm pretty sure that Ukraine cannot completely wipe out Russia. Russia's much bigger. Russia's got more manpower, more weapons. Ukraine's smaller, less people. The smart move would be to negotiate as early on as possible, come to an agreement that both countries are willing to live by, and then move on with life. Instead, I would say possibly millions of Ukrainians have died, maybe only hundreds of thousands. But they're conscripting 50-year-olds now in Ukraine and people with Down syndrome. It's getting really, really sad. And yet we just got to keep funneling money into Ukraine and giving them more weapons. I don't know who said it, but it sounds accurate, that the US is going to fight until the last Ukrainian. That's a little bit glib. Not exactly what I hope not exactly what's going to happen, but I haven't heard Biden talk about negotiations. He could be very hardline and, oh, Russia, we're going to beat you, but you need to negotiate with us. No, he's just, we'll just keep fighting. Putin's evil, got to keep fighting. Negotiation's not a bad idea.
I think, how can I say this without sounding too self-serving?
Self-serving.
I've not had any of my European allies come up to me and say, Joe, don't run. What I hear them say is, you've got to win. You can't let this guy come forward.
One reason might be that Trump forced a lot of the loafers in NATO to start actually carrying their weight. There were a lot of people, a lot of countries that were using our military for their defense. They didn't have hardly any military, or the spending of their military was so low that it was laughable. So Trump came in and basically forced all of them to start actually beefing up their militaries. And now that Biden's in, I'm pretty sure he doesn't keep their feet to the fire in that regard. So financially speaking, those countries probably would prefer that Biden stay in so that they can keep mooching off of America and letting America take care of their defense for them. it makes logical sense to me.
Disaster. It'd be a disaster. I mean, I think he said in one of his rallies, don't hold me to this, recently, where NATO, I just learned about NATO or something to that effect. Foreign policy has never been his strong point. And he seems to have an affinity to people who are authoritarian. That worries, as I tell you, from Poland, that worries Europe. That worries Poland. And nobody, including the people of Poland, think that if he wins in Ukraine, he's going to stop in Ukraine. But that's going to be the end of it. And so what I can say is, I think I'm the best qualified person to do the job, to make sure that Ukraine does not fall, that Ukraine succeeds, that the European alliance stays strong. You may recall, no one was talking about Finland joining NATO. I remember talking to Putin right after we got elected in Geneva, and he was talking about what we should do. We couldn't be in Eastern Europe, et cetera. And I said, you're looking for the Finlandization of Ukraine, because you're going to get the NATOization of Finland. And about 4 weeks later, I got a call. No, that's not true. Probably 5 months later, from the president of Finland, could he come and see me in my office? I invited him to the Oval Office. We sat down and talked. He said he wanted to join NATO. Could I help? And I did.
Russia wanted to join NATO, and that would have solved all of these problems. Russia wanted to join NATO in the 90s. I think it was the 90s. It was part of the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin that he talked about it. And I think that he talked to Clinton about joining NATO. And initially, Clinton was like, yeah, that actually sounds like a great idea. And then some of Clinton's advisors came up and was like, that's not going to happen. And then all of a sudden, nope, couldn't happen. But if Russia were to join NATO, all of a sudden Russia would be allies with all of the NATO countries, and Russia couldn't invade NATO countries because Russia would be part of NATO. So all of a sudden, Russia would be like, okay, Ukraine can come into NATO. We don't care. And there would be no invasion of Ukraine. There would have been no invasion of Georgia. There wouldn't have been a lot of the things that Russia has done that the U.S. is very upset about. Why do we care what happens on the far side of the world? Oh, we're the policemen of the world. That's why. We are so bellicose with our military standing around the world that it's no wonder that countries like Russia and Iran and North Korea and in some ways China are not happy with us. If you look at a map of military bases, U.S. military bases, we have Iran completely encroached in military bases, just completely surrounding Iran. Iran is like the size of Texas. I might be a little bit off on that, but its GDP is a lot less than the U.S. The U.S. we could crush Iran. It would be very difficult because it's a very mountainous area. But why do we care what's happening in Iran? Other than they have oil. They actually just elected a moderate that actually wants to work with the U.S. Has anyone in the U.S. or any news agency in the U.S. talked about that? I haven't heard anything from anybody. But yeah, Putin's evil and Russia's the great Satan or something like that. Yeah.
Wasn't automatic. And then I got a call from the Swedes. I beg your pardon? And so Finland
Remember what happened there?
joined NATO. 800-mile border is a significant, and they're already allies, but they weren't part of NATO. And you heard, I think you heard, maybe I can't recall whether he said it publicly in our closed meeting, but he wouldn't mind it being repeated. He said, we decided in Finland, the people of Finland decided they had to be part of NATO. It was in our interest because of the joint ability to be together, to dissuade any attack on Finland. And the same thing with Sweden. It took a lot of selling to some folks, particularly in Turkey and other places, to agree to the expansion. But it expanded. And we're a hell of a lot stronger because of it. We're more secure because of it. And by the way, I was able to get 50 other nations, 50, to support Ukraine. 50. We were able to bring about a coalition of Europe and Asia, Japan and South Korea. I just we talked about AUKUS, and we talked about the relationship between Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, the United States. We're making the world safer and stronger because
Making the world safer and stronger. And has he said anything about, negotiating, talking to Russia, seeing what can be done to stop the killing? I haven't heard anything about that. Russia might be like, okay, we'll leave as long as Ukraine doesn't enter NATO, because that's why they entered in the first place. We don't know if they'll accept that now. They might want to keep some of Ukraine, or have some of Ukraine as a buffer, because the U.S. is dead set on making sure that Ukraine is part of NATO. So maybe Russia wants a buffer between a NATO country and Russia. That makes sense to me when I've got a hostile enemy encroaching on my land. I prefer a buffer. Moscow's fairly close to the border with Ukraine. Having a little bit of a border so that you have a little bit of warning when an insane president sends a couple missiles towards Moscow, that makes sense to me.
because we have to deal with the new arrangement that exists in the world. The Cold War is over. The post-war era is over. What is
If the Cold War is over, why do we still have NATO? Because NATO was only created in answer to the Warsaw Pact. When the Soviet Union fell, NATO should have been disbanded because there was no more a Soviet Union to defend against. Not the military-industrial complex. They got to get their money.
going to replace it? And I respectfully suggest I have a pretty good idea what that should be. I've convinced a lot of people to follow it. We're just going to get stronger. David Sanger. Where's it?
Thank you, Mr. President.
Be nice, David.
Mr. President, the NATO declaration that was issued yesterday was very notable because it described China as a decisive enabler of the war in Ukraine for its provision of critical goods to the Russians. That's part of a broader partnership that seems to have cemented in place in the past 2 or 3 years. I think one that you were a little bit doubtful of when we asked you about it some time ago. So I'd be interested to know whether you have a strategy now of trying to interrupt the partnership between China and Russia, and whether or not in a second term you would pursue that, if you could describe that strategy to us. And along the way, could you also tell us whether you think, just to follow up on Felicia's question, that if you were in a room with Vladimir Putin again, the way you were 3 years ago, or with President Xi that a few years from now you will be able to go negotiate with them, handle them one-on-one?
Well, the first part of the question is, we discussed and I raised in the NATO summit and others raised the future of China's involvement, what they're going to do, what they're doing with Russia in terms of accommodating, facilitating. They're getting access to additional. They're not supplying weapons themselves. They're supplying mechanisms for them to be able to get weapons. And China's position is basically, and I've spent more time with Xi Jinping than any world leader has, over 90 hours since being vice president all the way through, for real. And by the way, I handed all my notes. But my point is that Xi believes that China is a large enough market that they can entice any country, including European countries, to invest there in return for commitments from Europe to do A, B, C, or D, or not to do certain things. What's happened is we had a long discussion about what we cannot, you have to make clear, China has to understand that if they are supplying Russia with information and capacity, along with working with North Korea and others to help Russia in armament, that they're not going to benefit economically as a consequence of that by getting the kind of investment they're looking for. And so, for example, we're in a situation where, and we've reestablished direct contact with China after that, remember the balloon, quote unquote, going down, and all of a sudden things came to an end? Well, we set up a new mechanism. There's a direct line between Xi and me, and our military has direct access to one another, and they contact one another when we have problems. The issue is that we have to make sure that Xi understands there's a price to pay for undercutting both the Pacific Basin as well as Europe, and as it relates to Russia and dealing with Ukraine. And so we, for example,
Talking and not a lot of information.
if you want to invest in China, as you know this area really well. If you want to invest in China, you have to have a 51% Chinese owner. You have to make sure that you do by their rules. And you don't have the authority, and you have to provide all access to all the data and information you have. There was a while there, as you recall, the last administration and other administrations, where the access to that market was enticing enough to get companies to come in because they had access to over 1 billion people in a market, not 1 billion, but a lot of people in the market. And so they were doing it. But that got curtailed when we started saying we're going to play by the same rules. For example, the idea they don't abide by the international rules related to subsidizing products by the government funding. So guess what? They're not going to be able to export their electric vehicles to the United States without a significant tariff. Others are doing the same thing around the world. But it is a concern. It is a concern that you have both.
So if China cheats, that's okay? Is that what he's saying? The word salad is difficult.
China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, countries that are not necessarily coordinated in the past, looking to figure out how they can have impact.
Love that impact.
Yes, I do, but I'm not prepared to talk about the detail of it in public. And I think you'll see that some of our European friends are going to be curtailing their investment in Russia. In China, as long as China continues to have this indirect help to Russia in terms of being able to help their economy as well as help them in as a consequence that their ability to fight in Ukraine. The other thing that we talked a lot about is that, and I raised it, and I didn't hear any. I can't swear that everyone agreed because not everyone got to talk about it. But we need a new industrial policy in the West. For example, we talked about how both the EU as well as NATO has to be able to begin to build their own munition capacity.
Conferences going on.
Has to be able to generate their own capacity to provide for weapons and the ability to. It came as a surprise to some of us how we had fallen behind in the West in terms of the ability to construct new material, new weaponry, new everything from vehicles to weapon systems. And so one of the things that came out of this was we're going to be meeting again with a number of my colleagues, my European colleagues, is what do we do to increase the capacity of the West, particularly in Europe and Japan, to be able to generate kind of ability to produce their own weapon systems, not just for themselves, but to be able to generate that. It's the same. It's what Russia's trying to figure out. That they went to China, and they didn't get the weapons, but then they went to North Korea. But we're going to be in a position where the West is going to become the industrial base for it to be able to the ability to have all the defensive weapons that we need. That was a discussion as well.
You answered on whether you would be ready to go deal with Putin and Xi 2 or 3 years from now.
I'm ready to deal with them now and 3 years from now. Look,
Again,
the,
cognitive test or question it on if he's cognitively there.
like I said, I'm dealing with Xi right now and direct contact with him. I have no good reason to talk to.
Yeah, I'm a little bit bored with this now. Let's scoot back a little bit though. I want to look at his eyes. So there's his eyes there. Looks the same. Looks the same. I don't know. His eyes looked more squinty towards the end, and were like wide open at the beginning, I thought. Maybe I was just thinking that because he's going nuts. Anyway, the Big Boy press conference, he had some major flubs in there. Calling President Trump his vice president, talking about him talking to the commander-in-chief, I mean the chief of staff. Yeah, there were a few. I don't think his general demeanor was that of an old man with memory issues. I don't think it helped. And again, it kind of makes it look like because the questions were scripted and he knew who he was going to call on, so he probably knew the answers to the questions that he already knew the questions they were going to ask. It kind of feels like he's dropping the ball on purpose. He's throwing the game and it's going to be handed off to someone else. I don't know. That would be interesting. Anyway, those are my thoughts. How do you think it went? Do you think he was a spry young man that was able to answer the questions incredibly well and introduce the president of Ukraine correctly? I don't know. Anyway, tell me what you think. Follow, like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.